In 2010, archaeologists unearthed a skeleton in York, England. The bones were nearly 2,000 years old. But when DNA tests came back, historians went silent. This wasn't a Viking, not a Saxon, not even Roman. She was African, a black woman buried with honor in ancient Britain. Her existence shatters everything you were taught about European history. And she's not alone. For centuries, European history has been whitewashed. And that's not just a figure of speech. It's literal. Textbooks have been carefully edited. Films have been meticulously cast. Museums have quietly organized their collections to tell one specific story: that ancient Britain was white. Exclusively, uniformly white. Medieval paintings were actually restored by Victorian conservators who lightened skin tones. Black figures documented in historical records were dismissed as mere servants or exotic curiosities, footnotes to the real story. The narrative was clear and unchallenged. Black people only arrived in Britain as enslaved labor during the colonial period, and before that, the island was a homogeneous white society stretching back to the mists of time. But here's what they didn't tell you. The Roman Empire wasn't just big. It was massive, spanning 3 continents, connecting the Scottish Highlands to the Sahara Desert, from the Atlantic coast to the deserts of Mesopotamia. From 43 AD to 410 AD, Britannia was a province of this vast multicultural empire. Soldiers rotated in from Egypt, Syria, North Africa, and Judea. Traders brought goods and their families from across the Mediterranean and beyond. Merchants, craftspeople, administrators, and slaves from every corner of the known world walked the cobbled streets of Londinium, stood guard on Hadrian's wall, and bathed in the thermal springs of Aquae Sulis, modern-day Bath. This wasn't some diverse exception. This was normal. This was the Roman world. Yet when Victorian scholars sat down to write the official history of Britain in the 1800s, they had a problem. Actually, they had several problems, but one massive conflict of interest loomed over everything. The British Empire was at the absolute height of the transatlantic slave trade. Ships bearing human cargo were crossing the Atlantic. Africans were being bought and sold in British colonies. The entire economic system depended on one foundational lie: that black people were inherently inferior, that Africa had no civilization, no history, no achievements worth noting, and that white Europeans had always been the sole architects of progress and culture. Now imagine you're one of these Victorian historians, and you start finding evidence that completely contradicts this narrative. Archaeological remains showing African ancestry in Roman Britain, historical documents mentioning black people living freely in medieval England, records of African soldiers, musicians, and traders integrated into British society centuries before the slave trade even began. What do you do with that evidence? If you're building an empire on the premise of racial superiority, you certainly don't publicize it. You don't put it in textbooks. You don't feature it in museums. You bury it, sometimes literally, in basement storage, where the public will never see it. You reinterpret it, explain it away, minimize its significance, and if you can't do that, you simply ignore it entirely. This systematic erasure wasn't some conspiracy theory. It was academic policy. Archaeological evidence that showed ethnic diversity in ancient Britain was routinely shelved. Skeletons that appeared to have African features were stored away without proper analysis. Historical records mentioning Moors, Ethiopians, or Africans in medieval England were treated as unreliable or misinterpreted. The message transmitted through every history class, every museum exhibit, every historical drama was absolute. Black history in Britain didn't exist before colonialism. full stop. But bones don't lie. And in 1901, construction workers in York discovered something that would eventually crack this narrative wide open, though it would take over a century for anyone to pay attention. They found a stone coffin, a sarcophagus of obvious quality and expense. Inside lay the skeleton of a woman, perhaps in her mid-30s when she died. And surrounding her were treasures, jewelry made of jet and ivory, expensive perfume bottles, ornate grave goods that spoke of wealth and status. This wasn't a pauper's grave. This was someone important, someone respected, possibly even someone of noble or royal standing. The burial dated to around 350 AD, deep in the Roman period. For decades, historians made an assumption. Of course, she was white. Of course, she was Roman nobility, perhaps the wife of a high-ranking official. That's what made sense. That's what fit the narrative. Her skeleton was studied, catalogued, and she was given a nickname, the Ivory Bangle Lady, after the expensive bangles found at her wrists. And then, in 2010, scientists decided to do something that previous generations had never bothered with. They analyzed her bones using modern techniques. They looked at her skull structure, her bone chemistry, her isotopic composition, and what they found stopped them cold. She was African, not Mediterranean, not Middle Eastern, sub-Saharan African. The bone analysis was unambiguous. This wealthy woman, buried with honor and expensive grave goods in the heart of Roman Britain, was black. Carbon dating confirmed she died around 350 AD. Chemical analysis of her teeth showed she'd likely grown up somewhere warmer, possibly North Africa, before coming to Britain as a young woman. She'd lived in York for years, possibly decades. And when she died, she was given a burial that rivaled anything accorded to white Roman citizens. The historical establishment didn't know what to do with this. How could a black woman be buried with such obvious honor and status in ancient Britain? Where was the enslavement? Where was the servitude? Where was the marginalization that the narrative required? The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Some tried to explain her away, suggesting maybe she was someone's exotic wife, a curiosity tolerated but not truly equal. But the grave goods didn't support that theory. Everything about her burial screamed equality, respect, integration. And then the discoveries started multiplying. Another skeleton, this one from Eastbourne on the south coast, dating to the 3rd century AD. DNA analysis revealed the same thing, sub-Saharan African ancestry. The Beachy Head woman, as she came to be known, had lived in Britain her entire adult life. Then another set of remains from a Roman cemetery in London showed North African heritage. Then another in Gloucester. And another. Each new discovery added another crack to the whitewashed narrative of British history. But the physical evidence was just the beginning. Researchers started actually reading the historical records that had been gathering dust for centuries. And what they found was remarkable. There were written accounts, administrative documents, military records that had been sitting in plain sight all along. One document in particular changed everything. Records of a Roman military unit called the Numeris Mororum Aurelianorum, a unit of Moorish soldiers from North Africa, stationed at Hadrian's Wall. Not just passing through, stationed there. For years, possibly generations. These weren't token soldiers or temporary deployments. These were fighting men, North African warriors defending Rome's northernmost frontier against Pictish raids. They lived in the forts along the wall. They married local women. They had children who were born British, but carried African blood. For over 300 years of Roman occupation, Black soldiers and their families lived, fought, loved, and died in Britain. They were part of the fabric of Romano-British society. And yet, somehow, when the history books were written in the Victorian era, they simply vanished from the story. The question becomes unavoidable. Why? Why would such a significant part of British history be erased so completely? The answer is as uncomfortable as it is obvious. When the British Empire began its colonization of Africa in the 1800s, when the slave trade was generating enormous wealth for British merchants, when racial pseudoscience was being invented to justify the subjugation of entire peoples, this history became incredibly inconvenient. You can't claim Africans are inferior and suited only for slavery when the historical record shows African soldiers defending Roman Britain. You can't claim black people have no civilization when archaeology proves they were living as equals in ancient European society. The cognitive dissonance was too great, so the evidence was buried. But let's jump forward in time, past the Roman period, past the chaotic centuries following Rome's withdrawal from Britain. Let's land in the year 1501, at the height of the Tudor dynasty. King Henry VII is on the throne, and his son, the future Henry VIII, is preparing for his coronation. The Westminster Tournament Roll, an illuminated manuscript created to commemorate the coronation festivities, shows the royal procession in exquisite detail. Musicians, nobles, knights, all painted with careful attention to their clothing, their instruments, their faces. And there, among the royal trumpeters, is a black man, not hidden in the background, not serving or enslaved. He's right there with the other court musicians, dressed in the same livery, holding the same expensive instrument. His name was John Blanky. Payment records prove he wasn't just decoration. John Blank was a professional court musician, employed first by Henry VII and then by his son, Henry VIII. He was paid the same wage as his white colleagues. He performed at royal weddings, tournaments, and state occasions. He was talented enough, respected enough, to be among the elite musicians of England. And here's the part that really drives it home. In 1511, John Blank petitioned King Henry VIII for a pay raise. And he got it. A black man in Tudor England, negotiating his salary with the king and winning. For 500 years, historians barely mentioned him. When he appeared in textbooks at all, it was as a curiosity, an exotic exception that proved the rule. But John Blank wasn't an exception. He was evidence of something far more significant, that black people in medieval England weren't just present. They were integrated into society at various levels, including the highest echelons of court life. And once researchers started looking, they found more. The Luttrell Psalter, an illuminated manuscript from the 1330s, shows a black woman as part of an English noble household, not as a servant, but as a lady-in-waiting. The Devonshire hunting tapestries from the 1430s depict black huntsmen in aristocratic settings, participating in noble leisure activities. Records from Balliol College, Oxford, mention a black student named John Moore in the 1480s. Parish records from across England document baptisms, marriages, and burials of black residents throughout the medieval period. Each piece of evidence told the same story, whispered the same truth. Black people weren't just present in medieval Britain. They were woven into the social fabric. They weren't all slaves or servants. Some were, certainly, but others were musicians, students, craftspeople, members of noble households. The diversity of roles, the integration into various social levels, all of it contradicted the narrative of black people as perpetual outsiders in European history. Then, in 2017, came the revelation that should have rewritten every history textbook in Britain, though predictably, most people never heard about it. The Museum of London Archaeology released findings from an exhaustive study analyzing over 20,000 skeletons from Roman London. 20,000 individuals, spanning centuries of occupation, representing the most comprehensive demographic study of ancient London ever conducted. And what they found was staggering. 10 to 15% of the population showed evidence of African or Middle Eastern ancestry. Let that sink in. In a city of roughly 60,000 people, there were potentially 6,000 to 9,000 people of color living, working, and raising families in Roman London. That's not a handful of exotic foreigners. That's not a few slaves or servants. That's a significant minority population comparable to many modern diverse cities. Roman London was more ethnically diverse than London in 1950, after centuries of trade and empire. These weren't just soldiers, though there were plenty of those. These were merchants running shops, craftspeople making pottery and jewelry, families raising children, priests tending temples, bureaucrats administering the province. People of African and Middle Eastern descent were thoroughly integrated into every level of Romano-British society, and the archaeological evidence proved it beyond any reasonable doubt. But the final revelation, the piece of evidence that truly puts the historical erasure in perspective, concerns a man whose story was never exactly hidden, but whose significance was carefully downplayed. His name was Lucius Septimius Severus, and he was born in Leptis Magna, in what is now Libya, North Africa. Ancient writers described him as having a dark complexion, African features. Modern historians have debated exactly how dark his skin was, which is itself revealing. They never debate the skin color of emperors assumed to be white. But regardless of the exact shade, Severus was African. And in 193 AD, he became Emperor of Rome. For 18 years, this African-born emperor ruled the largest empire the world had ever seen, commanding legions from Britain to Babylonia, controlling the entire Mediterranean world, wielding power that wouldn't be matched for 1,000 years. And in 208 AD, Emperor Septimius Severus decided to make Britain his base of operations. He brought his entire family, his wife Julia Domna, his sons Caracalla and Geta, his whole imperial court. They settled in York, the same city where the Ivory Bangle Lady had been buried decades earlier. For 3 years, the most powerful man on earth ruled from British soil. An African emperor, governing an empire that stretched across 3 continents, making military and political decisions that would shape the future of Europe, all from a headquarters in what is now northern England. Severus rebuilt Hadrian's Wall. He commanded military campaigns into Scotland. He minted coins bearing his distinctly African features that circulated throughout Britain. And in 211 AD, he died in York. The funeral of an African emperor took place on British soil, attended by Roman nobility, British tribal leaders, soldiers from across the empire. The historical irony is almost too much to bear. 1,500 years before the British Empire colonized Africa, before British ships carried enslaved Africans across the Atlantic, before racial pseudoscience tried to justify treating Africans as inferior, a black imperial family ruled Britain. The power dynamic was completely reversed. And yet, when British children learn about Roman Britain in school, how many are taught that an African emperor governed their island? How many history documentaries mention it? How many museum exhibits feature it prominently? This wasn't lost history. The evidence was always there. Victorian historians had access to the same Roman texts, the same archaeological sites, the same coins and inscriptions. They knew about Severus. They knew about the Moorish cavalry units. They had access to medieval manuscripts showing black people in Britain. They could have told this story at any point, but they chose not to. They chose to emphasize the parts of history that supported their contemporary political goals and to minimize or ignore the parts that contradicted their narrative of white European superiority and African inferiority. The erasure was deliberate, systematic, and ideological. Because here's the thing. If British school children learned that black Africans walked freely in ancient Britain, that they were soldiers and aristocrats and musicians and even emperors, if they learned that a black man ruled Britain from York in the 3rd century, it becomes much harder to justify the transatlantic slave trade. It becomes much harder to claim that Africans are naturally inferior, suited only for servitude. It becomes much harder to build an empire on the premise that white Europeans have always been the sole bearers of civilization, while Africa wallowed in primitive darkness. The truth, the buried truth, is that ancient Britain was diverse. Not diverse in the modern sense of deliberate inclusion policies, but diverse because the Roman Empire was diverse, because trade networks connected continents, because people have always moved, migrated, married across cultural boundaries when given the chance. The past was always more multicultural than the whitewashed version presented in textbooks and films. And this matters. It matters because history shapes how we see the present. When people argue that diversity is modern, unnatural, a contemporary political imposition on historically homogeneous societies, they're relying on a false version of history. When they claim that black people in European settings are historically inaccurate, they're repeating Victorian propaganda. The Ivory Bangle Lady proves them wrong. The Aurelian Moors prove them wrong. Emperor Septimius Severus proves them wrong. John Blanca proves them wrong. Every time you watch a historical film showing ancient Britain as exclusively white, remember that's a choice, not accuracy. Every time someone claims that ethnic diversity in historical dramas is political correctness gone mad, remember that the all-white version is actually the politically motivated distortion. The archaeological evidence, the DNA analysis, the historical records, all of it points to the same conclusion. Black people have been part of British history for 2,000 years, longer than the English language has existed in its current form, longer than Christianity has been on the island, longer than most of what we consider quintessentially British. Their stories were erased not because they were insignificant, but because they were threatening. Threatening to a worldview that required Africa to be primitive and Europe to be superior. Threatening to an economic system built on enslaving people whose ancestors had once stood as equals in Roman Britain. Threatening to an empire that needed to believe in its own racial supremacy to justify its conquest of a quarter of the globe. But archaeology doesn't lie. DNA doesn't lie. Bones don't lie. The truth has always been there, buried in the ground, waiting, and now it's emerging, one skeleton at a time, one DNA test at a time, one careful re-examination of historical records that were always available but never properly studied. The Ivory Bangle Lady is just the beginning. More discoveries are being made every year. More evidence is accumulating. The true diversity of ancient Britain is finally being acknowledged by serious historians, even if it hasn't yet filtered into popular consciousness. So the question isn't really, were there black people in ancient Britain? The evidence answers that definitively. Yes, absolutely, without question. The real question is, what else has been erased? What other inconvenient truths have been buried because they didn't fit the narrative that powerful people needed to tell? History is written by those in power, and they write it to justify that power. But the past itself, the physical evidence, the bones and DNA and artifacts, those tell a different story. A truer story. A more complex and interesting story. The past was always more diverse than they told you. And every time they tried to hide that diversity, every time they buried evidence or ignored documents, or explained away discoveries, they were admitting something crucial: that the truth was dangerous to them, that the real history, if widely known, would undermine everything they were trying to build. Well, the truth is coming out now. The question is, are we ready to listen? Are we ready to rewrite the textbooks, remake the films, reorganize the museum exhibits? Are we ready to tell the full story of Britain with all its complexity and diversity, or will we keep clinging to a comforting fiction? The Ivory Bangle Lady is waiting for an answer. So are the thousands of other Black Britons whose stories were buried for centuries. The truth is still being uncovered, one skeleton at a time. The only question is whether we have the courage to face it.